Disneyland! It's the happiest place on earth. My family has taken a lot of trips to Disney over the years, and every time I see ride-throughs of the rides and attractions, I get filled with nostalgia. And of all the lands in Disneyland, the area that fills me with the most nostalgia has gotta be Fantasyland. Normally I'm a Disney World kind of guy, but their Fantasyland pales in comparison to California's. That's because Disneyland's Fantasyland is filled with 5 of the most iconic dark rides. And today, I'm going to be ranking all of them, and even talking about some other versions at the other Disney parks. For clarification, I count a dark ride as a slow-moving ride that goes through a lot of different scenes. The Matterhorn bobsleds is more of a roller coaster as you're on a roller coaster track and you only look at a few Yetis. So the 5 dark rides we will be looking at are Peter Pan's Flight, Mr. Toad's Wild Ride, Snow White's Enchanted Wish, Alice in Wonderland, and Pinocchio's Daring Journey. I'm going to be ranking their rides on the most current version, so if you went to Disneyland right now, this is the ride you would be going on. Anyways, without further ado, let's start the list with number 5. We're starting the list with the ride that was probably the most traumatizing for a lot of kids like me, and that was Snow White's Enchanted Wish. Well, okay, Snow White's Enchanted Wish isn't the traumatizing one I'm talking about. I'm talking about Snow White's Scary Adventures. But even that wasn't the original name, as the OG opening day attraction was Snow White and Her Adventures. There's really no video of these opening day attractions, so I'll probably just say a brief summary of them. And in this case, the Snow White ride was always the scariest for some reason. Instead of focusing on Snow White and the happy lives of the 7 dwarves, they decided to focus on the witch practically hunting you down. Snow White's Scary Adventures opened with a new Fantasyland redesign in 1983, and this is the version that I wrote as a kid. I really like the line where you go through the castle and see the spell for the poison apple. The ride starts with you in the dwarves' cottage where the 7 dwarves and Snow White are partying and just having a good old time. Then you see the queen peering in through the window, being all evil. But then you just go to the 7 dwarves' mine and you get a look at all the crystals and the mine carts, and man, this ride is so cool. Then you enter the gates of the queen's castle and then the horror begins. I don't know why they decided to make the Snow White ride so scary, but I kinda like it. And you'll find that this isn't the only Fantasyland dark ride that was kind of unsettling. Probably the scariest part is when you're going through the woods and see all these trees and the alligators beside your carts. The witch offers you an apple, which is actually a hologram because so many people tried to take the physical apple. And then you see the 7 dwarves and the witch on the cliffside, the witch gets crushed by a boulder, and then the ride just ends. I remember this ride being a lot better, but I'm probably thinking of the Disney World version. This version isn't open today, but I remember riding it when I was a younger kid. It has this nice scene where you start going around the wishing well and you see Snow White, and all of the show scenes just seem better in this version. Not to mention that there were a few scenes you didn't see in any of the other versions. This is the version that probably scared me the most because I feel like the alligators were really present in this one, and I have a core memory of seeing one beside my minecart and losing my shit. The Disney World version also moved the dwarves' cottage scene to the middle of the ride, and it gave the ride a long happy ending scene which calmed the kids down a bit. All of that was a lot tamer than the OG Disney World version, which, wow, this was really traumatizing. You just straight up die at the end. Now that we're done with the history, let's get on with Snow White's Enchanted Wish. And full disclosure, I haven't been back to Disneyland to actually ride this version yet. But from the videos I've watched, they took out the scariness of Scary Adventures and just watered it down to make it happy for the kiddies. And in my opinion, it just seems so bland and dry, and the Disneyland Scary Adventures was already pretty bland to begin with. But at least they added a better happy ending scene, and the dwarves' mine scene looks really nice. I'm sure a lot of people have really nice things to say about Snow White's Enchanted Wish, but in my opinion, it's just too short and basic to be higher on the list. The next ride we'll be looking at is probably one of the most infamous dark rides, and that's Peter Pan's Flight. Or if we want to refer to the OG opening day attraction, just Peter Pan. Unlike Snow White, this ride has mostly stayed the same over the years, with even the Disney World version staying pretty similar. And fun fact about Disney World's version, it's the only ride on this list that still exists in Walt Disney World. The most unique thing about this ride is you ride in these pirate ships that are suspended from the ceiling. So it gives the illusion that you're flying over London and Neverland. The first time you ride this ride, it's really cool seeing yourself fly over cars and Big Ben, but for me, the more I ride this one, I kind of lose that immersion. Sure, the sets are impressive, but in the London and the Neverland scene, there's not much going on. I prefer the scene at the beginning of the ride where you're in the nursery and you're seeing all the animatronics, but my favorite scene is at the end of the ride where you're flying over the pirate ship. In my opinion, the London and Neverland scenes just don't have as many big objects to draw your attention to, and they go on a little too long. But I think everyone's biggest critique about this ride is that the wait times are consistently 40 minutes or longer. If you want to ride Peter Pan's flight for the first time, then sure, maybe you'll be able to wait in a line this long. But if you're revisiting this park and just want to quickly go through the line, yeah, that's not gonna happen. And speaking of the line, Disneyland's line is outside and there's not much going on, compared to Disney World's queue, which is inside and has a lot of cool visuals for you to look at while you wait. Overall, I think Peter Pan's flight is a little overrated, but I still think it's an enjoyable ride. In the middle of the list, we have a ride I usually forget about, and that's Pinocchio's Daring Journey. Now, even though this ride is forgettable to me, whenever I see videos of it, I remember just how good of a dark ride it is. Pinocchio was the last ride to appear in Fantasyland, as the first version didn't open until the new Fantasyland update in 1983. But this version has remained relatively unchanged and is still open today. The ride starts innocently enough with you seeing Pinocchio in the puppet theater, but then immediately after you're hit with some unsettling show scenes. Stromboli has Pinocchio caught in a cage and he manages to capture you too, but you manage to find an escape. Then you visit Pleasure Island, and at first it seems like the ideal dream for a child. But the longer the scene goes on, the more you see some hints that this may not be the place it's cracked up to be. You see Lampwick get turned into a donkey, and sometimes the evil guy will say this.
He always makes a jackass out of himself.
Now that I'm older, I know that's just another term for a donkey, but child me could not believe my ears. Then the ride gets scary and borderline depressing. You pass donkeys crying for their parents, escape more entrapment, and then get eaten by Monstro. But luckily, this ride does have a happy ending as you end up finding your way back to Geppetto's. I really like the effect and music they use for the ferry, but I'm kind of indifferent to the rest of the ending. You can tell it's there to calm kids down, but I'm not a big fan of looking at Geppetto's knickknacks. But looking at the whole ride, you flow from scene to scene really nice, and overall it's a very solid ride. I've never seen the original Pinocchio, but I'm able to gather the story by riding this ride. And for those reasons, I think it deserves a spot on the podium. Now we are on to two of my favorite dark rides, and we're starting off with Alice in Wonderland. This ride was the fourth to show up in Fantasyland, as it opened in 1958, 3 years after the park opened. Like Snow White, the original Alice in Wonderland was a little unsettling, but it did include one of the ride's most iconic features, and that's the fact that this ride travels on 2 levels. I'll talk more about this later. Alice in Wonderland took a little bit longer to update for New Fantasyland, as it didn't open until 1984. And while this version is still the one that is open today, it did go under a pretty substantial refurbishment in 2014. So I'll compare and contrast any changes as we go along. But first of all, I gotta point out these ride vehicles. I just love the caterpillar design. The ride starts with you falling down the rabbit hole and you see the doorknob who lets you into Wonderland. While I do like the warp perspective floor and the bunny rabbit painting of the original, I like the video of Alice chasing the rabbit they added in after the refurbishment. After starting with a really great hook, I fall even more in love with the ride here in the garden scene. The music and scenery as you ascend through the garden and look at the plants is just so cool. The Tulgey Woods scene is where this ride can get a little unsettling, but it's not as bad as Pinocchio or Snow White. And also, they did add an Alice figure after the refurbishment. But probably my favorite scene in this ride is the Queen's Courtyard. For one, you get to hear the song the cards sing when they paint the roses red, and you get to see all of them running around, which is pretty funny. After the refurbishment, they improved the screen you look at when you see the Queen's biffed croquet shot, but once again, I prefer the pre-refurbishment version when you shoved your way through all the cards. After hearing Goofy screaming for some reason, you end up outside and get some pretty cool views of the park. However, it does go on a bit long. Also, I found out they had to make a temporary fix to this in 2010 because of OSHA violations. The ride ends with this Mad Tea Party scene, but it just feels way too short, even with the lead up they added after the refurbishment. But all things considered, this is such a great ride. It really makes you feel like you're in Wonderland, and it is also the longest ride on this list. However, it doesn't beat number 1 on this list, which is my favorite ride in Disneyland. And that is Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. I gotta start by saying, this ride is definitely not as technically impressive as Alice in Wonderland or even Pinocchio's Daring Journey. But to understand why I love this ride so much, you should probably hear this story I have attached to it. I can't remember how young I was when this story happened, but I think it was when I was around 5 or 6 years old. I want to say it was my second visit to Disneyland, and I just got off the carousel in the middle of Fantasyland. My mom asked me what ride I wanted to do next, and I really didn't have any preference since I had rode every ride in Fantasyland. Or at least I thought I had. My mom pointed to a castle-shaped building. My mom claimed it was a ride, and being curious, I followed her in line. That's when I rode Mr. Toad's Wild Ride for the first time, and I fell in love with the pure and utter chaos that this ride provides. First of all, I gotta point out the queue and exterior of this ride. I love the Toad Hall entrance, and I also love the motor car photo op they offer you. And the queue for this ride is actually one of the better ones in Fantasyland. There's a nice courtyard area they'll lead you through if the line gets long enough. And once you walk inside Toad Hall, I love all the little decorations and paintings on the wall. Now, even before you get on this ride, you can see how hectic it is. You see cars entering a door, exiting through a fireplace, and then going through another door. And once you get on the ride, you learn you're crashing through a library, crashing through a fireplace, almost getting crushed by a knight, and then going on to explore the rest of Toad Hall. And from there, you're just crashing into everything. You crash into this guy eating dinner, police are yelling at you, you crash into this guy and his sheep, you almost fall off the end of a bumpy pier, you crash into all these explosives, you blow up those explosives, you get drunk, you create more OSHA violations, you go to jail, you get hit by a train, and then you die and go to hell! Which, not to mention, has always been a part of the ride. This ride is already insane, but the Disney World version was even crazier. It had 2 tracks that you can ride on, providing 2 completely different experiences. Some scenes like driving through Toad Hall, downtown, and going to hell were present in the Disneyland version. But some of the scenes were completely original and even crazier. I mean, look at this! Weasels are just straight up having a shootout with the cops! I really wish I could ride this ride today, but unfortunately in its place is Winnie the Pooh. Which, to be fair, I do really like that ride, but I would prefer Mr. Toad any day. But as it is, I still love Disneyland's Mr. Toad's Wild Ride. It's such a chaotic and fun ride, and it'll be my favorite for years to come. And that's my ranking. Let me know in the comments which dark ride is your favorite. And also, I had a lot of fun making this video. It brought back a lot of memories I had of going to Disneyland when I was a kid. These dark rides will always hold a place in the hearts of many for being iconic and kid-friendly. Well, almost all of them are kid-friendly.